Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Dragon Prince Online podcast. This is going to be our review for the Dragon Prince Book 3 Sun. So we obviously do these every time a new book of the Dragon Prince comes out. Basically, this is the kind of podcast team from Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com. That's the fan site where we host the podcast. I'm going to be your main host for this episode, Morgan, Airspeed Prime. And joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, as I said at the start, we will be reviewing the third season of The Dragon Prince, which is Book 3 Sun. We got another 9 episodes after a decent delay here. We were kind of wondering what was going on, why was it taking so long, and finally we have that third season. We get to go into Xadia here, and in general, the way we'll do the discussion here is we'll start off with some general, just pretty quick thoughts on the season overall. Then we'll jump into kind of going through it episode by episode. So we'll start with episode 1, talk about the key things that happened in the first episode, move on to episode 2, and do the same all the way throughout the season. That way we sort of do it in order, we hit everything that we have to, and it's probably the best way to do it. So Greg, overall, what were your thoughts on Book 3, Sun?
Overall, I thought it was pretty good. I liked that it finally got to the point where it was giving us enough sort of answers for a lot of the previous things that they have sort of built up to. So from that regard, I think it was pretty good to sort of get a good amount of questions opening. I think the way that it ended was interesting, and I guess I'll touch on that a bit later. But overall, I thought it was pretty good to finally get, some more things moving along in the story that I don't know, maybe just because of how, the story has been structured or just the flow of things seems like it took a bit to get there.
Yeah, I think that's what we said on the first 2 podcasts covering Book 1 and Book 2 is that it's good, but it's definitely a little slow. The chunks of episodes that they're choosing to kind of put out there as like a season don't kind of maybe work as well as, say, like Avatar, which is the other thing that has the sort of book structure. This one definitely works a lot better because we're in Xadia. There's a lot more interesting things going on. This section of the story they chose to be, I think, a lot more impactful with regards to like big character decisions, lots of plot happening. In that, it very much feels like the finale to like the first section of the story. In that, if not for the like final scene, effectively, of the season, you could almost see a way where like this is a conclusion in a way to core
Exactly.
story.
Yeah.
And if not for the fact that we knew that like they have like what 4, 5 more seasons planned, this would definitely feel like a conclusion. But I definitely will praise it for having the faster pacing. I know some people were a little frustrated that it maybe went too fast on some of these kind of talking points, but
Mm.
I like that. I prefer that they do that rather than the much slower Book 1 and Book 2 for me. But we'll get into the first episode here, which is Sol Regum, and this is where we ended the last season. The cliffhanger was that we're in Xadia, but here's this dragon we've seen in like all the promo material, Sol Regum, blocking the way. What's gonna happen here? And I really like the way they started off the season. We get a flashback to, I believe it's like 1,000 or something years ago, with a confrontation between the then King of the Dragons, Sol Regum, and Ziard, who is the Dark Mage, basically the guy who like I think invented dark magic. And it's a pretty interesting discussion here in that they've obviously agreed to meet on this mountaintop. They both agree initially to not hurt each other. And the conversation is effectively that Sol wants Ziard and humans to stop using dark magic, and he's sort of threatening to destroy this whole town of Alarion that will kill basically hundreds of thousands of people if Ziard doesn't do this. And we get the points brought up here of like Ziard kind of points out that humans having dark magic allows them to sort of have something, because otherwise they don't naturally have a relationship with any form of magic, and they kind of feel lesser because of that. And Sol just sort of points out that from his point of view, he sees humans as actually being lesser beings. So pretty interesting stuff here. He goes to attack the city to destroy it. Ziyard uses some pretty crazy dark magic, and this causes Soul to come back and fight him. And we basically just get them throwing big fire attacks at each other. Ziyard gets obliterated here, but his attack does blind Soul, which is the backstory for why Soul currently looks the way he does. And then probably the most interesting thing they talked about in the middle of this was that Ziyard's staff is basically the same staff that Viren has, and he mentions that the staff is a gift from one of the Great Ones, and that's something that's like never been mentioned, I think, up to now in the whole show, where this is, where he got it from, and I suppose it relates to where he got the information for dark magic from, and it was interesting that that seemed to be the thing that enraged Soul more than anything else. But what were your thoughts on this opening flashback sequence?
Yeah, I thought this was pretty good, especially when I saw it for the first time in the convention. Yeah, I think it was good to finally sort of get this sort of background on a dragon that we've, like you mentioned, we've seen in all the promos. So we know, he has some importance to the story. So to finally get it and to see sort of the reasoning behind it, as well as get, just more detail on sort of, I guess, the history of sort of like the humans having, dark magic and, still not getting all the answers, of course, but, getting more of a foundation for it, and just to see the similarities with the staff and to see that, it wasn't necessarily the humans that sort of, figured this out on their own. It makes makes the story a lot more intriguing, which I think is good.
Yeah, and it definitely presented what the kind of extended opening for like the first episode talked about, when it like explained to us the different types of magic and the general situation of like why humans are separate than like all the other species, and like you're sort of questioning, like, do you blame it all on the humans, or is it also like Zadia kind of having that view of humans that like they're outcast because they're not connected to magic, and why is that the case? And you almost forget this season until they mention it towards the end that like, oh yeah, Callum is unique because he like unlocked an arcanum of magic as a human, so it's possible. Well, what's caused this situation, and why is it so shocking? And you get that here, and that Ziyard clearly cares for his people and doesn't want them to be the lowest kind of sentient species in the world. And Soul, as the king at this point, is clearly has a very poor relationship with humans just because of dark magic, and isn't handling the situation so well. And it's just a good piece of history. Like we'll talk about the other flashback that we get later on, but I thought it was a great way to open the season. The rest of episode 1 is kind of it's a very different type of episode in that it's mainly Rayla, Callum, and Zim just trying to sneak past blind Soul. And it's just a bunch of sequences of them trying to do this, then that, and he's just kind of breathing fire at them. And it turns out that, okay, the only way we're going to be able to do this is to actually just go up and talk to him. And so Rayla goes up, reveals Zim is the Dragon Prince, and he basically ends up agreeing that Rayla and Zim can go through, but because he hates humans, Callum can't pass. Rayla speaks up for him, calls him her best friend, they hold hands, the first like romance tease kind of comes up here, and eventually they're forced to escape. They use this kind of plan of Callum's scent, where he uses like Aspero to send the scent off one way and distract Soul, and they basically get by him that way. For the cliffhanger kind of reveal going between seasons, I thought the actual use of Sol Regum in the present wasn't all that great, other than to get across the idea that he still hates humans all these years later, and it doesn't seem like there's that much hope for him. But what were your thoughts on the Rayla Callum stuff with Soul?
I think it was nice. It was just a way for them to sort of continue on and moving through it. It was a nice little bit, I guess, of sort of like misdirection, which is sort of, a sort of thing that Callum would sort of think of. So, definitely fit sort of in character, and, Rayla sort of, using the scarf to sort of, lure him away and sort of trap him. But yeah, I guess, 1,000 years of him sort of just being angry isn't really sort of going to change him automatically, which is interesting. I think it was interesting to note that, besides this fact of just hatred of humans in general, which is clearly sort of warranted in this case, I guess. It's just also the idea that, Callum has, used, dark magic once before, so he sort of, mentions that, and that's sort of, I guess just another reason for him to not like Callum. I don't know if, or I don't know how you would actually do that, but show him that he can use sort of natural magic. Would that have helped this case anymore? Probably not in this case, but it's interesting just to see, I don't know, that sort of idea come up again just right here in the beginning when it was sort of the whole sort of issue of the flashback.
hmm the rest of the episode, the other side plots here are basically we have Amaya at the Breach Fortress here on the human side. They're preparing for an attack from Janai and her Sunfire Elf forces. Gren returns because he was captive by Viren in previous seasons, so that's a pretty cool reunion. And they just decide that they have to destroy the breach, that there's no way they can hold them off, so they're just going to destroy the bit that sort of connects the two sides, and that'll be their way of sort of defending it. So we have again another Janai versus Amaya confrontation. She ends up setting off the explosion, the explosive charges, and this leaves a situation where Janai is hanging off the edge of the cliff. And surprisingly, Amaya actually saves her, even though they're enemies. But doing this gets Amaya captured by the Sunfire Elves. So this becomes, I think, a pretty interesting thing over the course of the season. I think it was always a bit of a confusing plot point in that I never felt it was explained particularly well, like in season two, like the specific location, why it's as important as they're making it out to be. It just felt like we just dropped in here as a way to have a fight. But they did an okay job with it, and I do like where they go with it. But what are your thoughts on the Amaya scenes?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the scenes themselves is cool just to see, Maya and just another sort of battle, sort of formation there. But yeah, no, I do sort of get the point of it doesn't, it's definitely not clear. I think, maybe just not knowing the geography until, this season really sort of didn't make it sort of understand. Because, it's like an important sort of, point that they're sort of defending against. And you can see, sort of that there's another side over there. But I think, when we finally, just this whole season of finally getting into Zadia, I think really sort of, it expands the world enough beyond just sort of what we know as the humans in their sort of like immediate sort of area to sort of explain and just, I guess that and just the whole idea, just the more importance of just sort of the war in general that they're sort of having or trying to start now, I guess sort of explains that a lot better finally.
hmm I suppose the transition between episode 1 and 2 is that we end the episode with like Viren is being talked to by Aravos in prison, and then Ezran returns and takes up his place as the king, which sets up episode 2, The Crown, which features a bunch of different things. I don't think it's the most impactful episode over the course of the season. We have Callum and Rayla in Zadia. Callum being impressed by absolutely everything he sees because he's got the cube that tells him which form of magic everything is giving off, and they just play up all the jokes of like every animal is connected to magic, and then the big joke is obviously even the dirt is magic. It's giving off like earth energy and stuff like that. So very fun thing to just see Callum be super impressed, and Rayla's just like, yeah, this is just normal for us. And that's pretty much about it on their side of the story. I suppose do you have any quick thoughts on just Callum in Zadia, his first experience?
Um, no, I mean, I think, his reaction to it pretty much seems to be in line of, what he as a character would do. He's just, he's sort of amazed by everything, sort of the creatures, just sort of the magic around. I think for him, that being sort of like his main thing as like a character definitely sort of fit in place.
hmm Basically the rest of the episode is Ezran's first experiences as being king. So after just a couple of nice moments as he gets to see the sort of be the finer points of life of being the king, he has to obviously settle down to do some of the business. So we immediately find out that the other nations are suffering from being attacked by assassins, which I believe was that kind of crazy dark magic spell that like Aravos and Viren did in at a certain point in season 2, and we find out that like one of the leaders of one of the other nations has been killed, one of the other ones has been hurt. This is when Claudia and Soren are brought in as traitors because they obviously assume they were working for their father, who is in jail, of course. This is when Prince Kasef of Neolandia arrives, and he basically just wants to avenge his father, who they do reveal is just injured. He's not like dead, which I thought was an interesting one, that they almost acted like he was dead initially, but then had to reveal later on he's actually still alive. But he wants Ezran and Catullus to join them in the war against Zadia, and he obviously doesn't want to do this. They're getting across that Ezran is very idealistic. He doesn't want to do things in the same way as before because he obviously likes animals. He has had so far good interactions with Zadia. He doesn't want to go to war over stuff from the past, basically. And there's some interesting stuff here as we see some of the advisors, want him to maybe, consider, giving the responsibility of running the kingdom over to the advisors until he's older. Then he can step up and do what he needs to do. But in the end, he decides that, he is going to remain as king. He doesn't have to be like his father. He won't do those same things and just continue the cycle of revenge, basically. He sets Soren and Claudia free because he doesn't want to blame them for the actions of their father, and they won't go to war, basically. No avenging, they will have peace. So, pretty strong, but obviously very idealistic, and they're kind of pointing out that it's perhaps too idealistic from Ezran, but it's nice to see him kind of showing that, strength even though he's so young. What were your thoughts on this episode, which was almost completely about Ezran as king?
Yeah, no, I think for once, I think that was actually probably the right choice as far as giving him some time to sort of develop as sort of like a character and sort of as a king. I mean, there's not, he doesn't, he is very sort of idealistic, which of course is just sort of, him as a character and him as his age and his, experience up to this point. I mean, I like, they have a couple, sort of deeper sort of conversations here with him and his advisors, sort of about sort of just him and just sort of being, just a young kid in this sort of situation. So it's interesting to see him who, before we see him as more of a sort of happy-go-lucky type kid to sort of go into this role of this position of sort of leadership and seeing how he acts at it in the first time. And, it is a bit idealistic and, of course it doesn't really turn out in the best sort of way by the end of these at least initial sort of couple episodes. But, he's at least trying to sort of hold his ground for now.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose because we do get introduced to him here, he does more over the course of the season, but what were your thoughts on them kind of introducing Prince Kasif here, who becomes pretty important over the season?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they clearly just put him as sort of like the main sort of antagonistic sort of against sort of Ezra and sort of his, sort of ideals. It almost seems like he's a bit sort of like too hardened for, what he's actually sort of experienced. I mean, I guess, he is considerably older. I don't know if they ever say his exact sort of age, but, you can see he's, I don't know, late teens, early 20s or something like that. So, of course, he does have a lot more experience than, his father, who isn't dead, but is sort of, I guess, maybe gravely injured, is, of course, influencing his sort of actions right now. So, it's interesting. I don't know, his character over the course of the season is interesting, how they make him really, by the end of it, you really don't care about him at all, which I guess, for what he, eventually does kind of makes sense. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I actually ended up really liking how they used him because he's meant to just represent obviously the opposite of Ezran, the one who just wants to kind of continue the revenge against Zadia and not actually lead to any actual change. Like the idea of Ezran specifically says no more avenging, whereas that's exactly what Kasif wants to do. So I did like that. Again, he's not the most in-depth character or anything like that, in that you're meant to kind of see his sort of like fall from grace in a way as a prince to what he becomes at the end. But I think he plays his role pretty well. But we'll move into episode 3 next, which is called Ghost. And here we move away from Ezran for a while. We just, again, sort of roughly in the background get across the idea that Ezran's still being very idealistic, and he's beginning to get a lack of support as king from certain advisors, but some of them are still very supportive of him. But the main focus of this episode is that we do get Rayla arriving home at the Silver Grove here in Moonshadow Elf territory. She reveals that they have to do this dance, which is basically her key to undo the spell, which basically gets them into where the Moonshadow Elves live. And she does this with Callum, and it's a full-on dance-like sequence, basically. They get in, and Rayla's all happy until they realize that the faces of everyone that they see, all the other Moonshadow elves, are blank, and she reveals that she's been made into a ghost basically by the clan. That effectively she's been magically banished by them, which is the exact same thing that happened to her parents. And we see they go to visit Athari, who is Runan's husband, and the two of them raised Rayla after what happened to her parents. And he too, the someone she really trusted, also is unable to see her. But they reveal that they can actually see each other through reflections. And he just notes here in this first section of the episode that from his perspective, she betrayed the assassination group from season 1, and now they're all gone, including Runan. So, what are your thoughts on this first section here of Rayla's return home?
Yeah, no, I mean it was a nice sequence of seeing how they actually sort of got into the place. But yeah, no, I think it's interesting that this is sort of like a repeat of what sort of happened to her parents, and she has to sort of experience it now. But she thinks, at least initially, that she does have someone that she can sort of go back to and sort of maybe sort of clarify things of what's actually going on. But I don't know, I think it's interesting just to see sort of her experience coming back and seeing Callum and seeing I guess sort of the magical reveal of this location, which was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And then the kind of end of the episode is that as they're about to leave, Athari does come out to the kind of pond where they have a talk, because they can see each other in the water reflection this time out. And he basically realized that he had to speak to her before they left. He temporarily sort of undoes the spell. He sort of reveals that he's not as good with magic as the other Moonshadow elves. He's more of a sort of kind of craftsman in a way of the clan. And he basically just talks about, she reveals, of course, they have the Dragon Prince, and he's happy about that. And he sort of realizes that in a way they have made mistakes. I suppose the clan has made mistakes in just banishing Rayla for not really knowing the full story of what happened. He does reveal at this point that the Dragon Queen is dying because of obviously the loss of her child as well as her mate, and Athari just gives them these kind of mounts, these animals, so they can get there faster, and that he'll send a message in one of the kind of arrows that transforms into a bird. He then hands over his moon opal necklace, which he says Runan had the pair to that. And then we end the sequence with a tease that Runan is actually still alive, because the flowers are meant to represent all of the assassins that went out on the mission, and Rayla's is still floating, but then sort of halfway sunk is Runan's, getting across the idea that he's gonna make an appearance again at some point. And I think towards the end of the episode they tease as to exactly how he's going to come back. But yeah, I like this as this father figure to Rayla, the role that they had him play. This season it doesn't really come across particularly well for the Moonshadow elves with regards to they just banish people because they assume they betrayed them. And that happened with Rayla, but they also assume the exact same stuff about her parents as is revealed. So it makes them seem a little ooh, you tend to act very quickly on this stuff. But you definitely feel for Rayla, and it gets across the point that Callum's going to make over the next few episodes of how much he's put on the line to help the Dragon Prince. But what are your thoughts on this sequence here?
Yeah, no, I thought this was, it was very nice to sort of see, Rayla's father figure here and sort of see the connection that they have, and see, you definitely do get a sense of, she didn't really, she made, a choice as far as, what she thought was the right thing to do, and is trying to sort of, stay with it the best way that's here. So it's nice to see that at least, someone from her tribe can sort of, understand, where she's going from, and, maybe in the future, there'll be some way to sort of reverse the sort of issue here. But I think, regardless of that, by the end of the whole season, she's probably in a better place as far as that's concerned. And yeah, it was cool to see, sort of the flower sort of half there, which I guess you kind of sort of got the idea just even from before, just how he's in the sort of coin is that, he could potentially be reversed out of there. So it was nice to see, how they're sort of looping all of that back together here, and how, it's like a little slimmer of hope here that, could make things better if things do turn out, the right way.
Hmm. We get a couple of scenes here of Amaya as a prisoner being brought into Sunfire Elf territory. Janai brings her before the Queen, who is her sister. And initially, the Queen is very much like, just kill her. She's just a human. But we see Janai really kind of speaking up for Amaya here because, like, she saved me. She's a true warrior. I don't think we should just kill her. So they have Amaya undergo this test, which is like the test of light, where they have this like staff that they shine this blinding light basically in their face, and if you can look into it and not be destroyed or whatever, it shows you have a pure heart and you're trustworthy. So it's fine. She can be okay. She can stay. She's alive, but she is going to be kept prisoner still. But the idea is that this is Jedi returning the favor for what Amaya did before, just showing you that like they there's a kind of odd friendship beginning to sort of grow between the two of them, and we'll see where it goes from here on out. And the test of light becomes sort of important later on. So I thought this played a good role in terms of like this will be much more plot focused in a few episodes, but just the tease right here. But what were your thoughts about this scene, getting to meet the Queen of the Sunfire Elves?
Yeah, no, that definitely was a good sort of way of setting up sort of how they're gonna, I guess, sort of determine if, these humans that they happen to sort of come interact with are sort of trustworthy or not. So no, I think it was nice. I mean, you can generally tell that Maya is sort of like, even though she is a warrior character, obviously, she has sort of like, better intentions than most rather than sort of like Varian or anything like that. So it's nice to get to see that. And I don't know, I think it's interesting how sort of the idea of the test and just the Queen's general attitude towards human just sort of reinforces, I guess, sort of earlier episodes idea of just sort of humans being lesser forms. Like even when she says to sort of take her away, she says, like have fun with your pet or whatever. So just, I guess, sort of reinforcing the idea that humans are sort of like a lower class is seen here.
Mm-hmm. Final plot point from this episode would be Claudia and Soren go to visit their father in prison. So this is the big one of like they've just found this out, they've been freed, but Viren is of course still in prison. They reveal to him that the Dragon Prince has hatched, and he's very shocked by this. We see again Viren not particularly caring about Soren and how he could have died, because of course a lot happened to Soren last season. Um, and they basically confront him about why did you ask Soren to kill the princes? And Aravos warns Viren through his ear basically that you have to lie about this. You can't tell them the truth or you'll lose them for good and you'll need them. Mainly Claudia is the idea that they get across here. So Viren lies and basically makes it out that, oh, Soren's just being an idiot again and he completely misunderstood me, and Claudia is like immediately convinced by this. But you can tell that Soren is sort of hurt, that like he's aware of like, okay, I'm not the smartest character, but I know what way you talk to me, but he's sort of forced to just accept it. And it's definitely presenting the rift that happens. I think it's really well set up. I think Soren over the course of this season was probably my favorite character in terms of what they did with him. In terms of like a big character arc and really growing to care about the character, I thought they did a very good job, and it sort of started with this scene. But what were your thoughts on this Claudia and Soren scene?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that sort of idea of just sort of Soren and him sort of coming into his own sort of character here. But yeah, I mean, you can see, where the rift begins here and just sort of the realization of how, Soren views himself towards his father, which, he was always, and he even goes in more in detail to this later on, just sort of, his way of just sort of idealizing his sort of father and sort of, the reason why he was, willing to do the things that he was trying to do, throughout the last season here. But yeah, no, just this sort of idea and just sort of how, this family here is just sort of slowly sort of breaking apart, I think is definitely, one of the things that they focused on throughout this whole season for sure.
Mm-hmm. The only other thing in this episode is like a tease that there's some sort of political behind the scenes stuff going on. One of the advisors brings Kasef to visit Viren, and you can tell there's some stuff going on as we enter episode 4, The Midnight Desert. And basically, we find out here that we're introduced to this new character here, Nyx, who is a Skywing elf, as we learn later on, specifically one of the rare winged ones who has wings just on their body. Um, and basically she steals the message that was sent by Athari and acts like she is the emissary of the Dragon Queen, so she can sort of get some sort of a bounty or a reward for delivering Zim back to the Queen, even though she basically didn't really do anything here. So she's just trying to trick them to get a greedy reward out of this. And she basically just says that, like, okay, you need to pass the Midnight Desert, otherwise it will take you way too long to go around it, because, again, the Queen is dying, so they have to do this. She has this giant animal called an Ambler, which is basically just a giant giraffe-like thing, and they cross the oasis, they cross the desert here, breaking halfway across to stay at the desert. And we set up some more sort of emotional stuff here, as we'll get to. But what were your thoughts on the introduction of Nyx here?
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to see sort of another sort of, I guess, sort of conniving type character here, and just to see, how she's, I guess, temporarily sort of integrated into the group here. I don't know. I think it's interesting just to see how that plays out, and how it's it's not like a huge thing or anything, but it's it's enough of a almost like a sidetrack, but not really one, because they're still moving towards where they're needing to go. But it's a time for them to, I guess, to sort of basically just have like a break and not have to be sort of like on the move directly. So it's a nice way of, I guess, keeping the story going while things are still happening between the characters and the beats and stuff.
Yeah, Nyx is a pretty interesting character, because as much as she's like kind of scheming and up to no good, it's a very like minor type thing, in that ultimately, even if she did take Zim and they didn't get him back, she was still planning to deliver him back to the Queen anyway. So like, it's more of just a thing of like, we need to do this because we set out to do this on our own. Like, you're not taking credit for this more than anything, and just stopping someone from being greedy. And in the end, you find out that, like, yeah, she's not really that bad. She's just sort of a bit of a trickster type character, and I get the impression we'll probably see her again, and she'll turn up in a more sort of a friendly type situation. I think the fact that, like, even she can sort of see the relationship that's sort of blossoming between the two of them, and teases them a bit about it. Like, I don't think she's just going to be one and done. Because over the entire season, we've seen like a few little awkward moments between Rayla and Callum, as they've, been here basically on their own with Zim, and they've sort of bonded ever closer. And we see when they take the break at the Oasis, that at nighttime, Rayla cries, and she basically talks to Callum about how she's lost everything. She doesn't belong anywhere now. She blames herself for everything, that she thinks she's failed and that she's not good enough. And Callum basically says the exact opposite of that. She talks about how amazing she is, how beautiful she is, and that she's a hero. And this is when Rayla kisses Callum. There's a lot of confusion, awkwardness, and it's just sort of left there. And eventually Rayla just is like, never speak of this again, and they just kind of leave it like that. What were your thoughts on them going for the relationship right here? Just because I know a lot of people are like, should they have done it or should they have not done it? But what were your thoughts on committing to it right now?
That's a good one. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it bothered me too much, because it seemed, from what they've been doing so far, they've been building up to this point sort of here. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess with them sort of being together and just on this journey, it almost seems like that's sort of like the default thing to sort of happen in this sort of case here. And, it's not sort of perfect by this one. There's still, a bit sort of few issues, and, they do sort of come together by the end of things. So I don't know. I think, at this point, I guess, she was sort of, I guess, enough to be sort of open to it. And, Callum, he's just sort of trying to sort of comfort her. So So it seemed like that was sort of like, I guess in this instance, the natural sort of progression of what they were sort of building up to. I mean, I don't know, if they would have dragged it out longer, would that have been sort of better? I mean, the way that they end the season, it seems like that's sort of one of the things that sort of, helps things that actually sort of work out towards their sort of favor, since, they're sort of trying to build this whole new sort of like, relations between sort of the two, species that generally hasn't been on sort of like the best of terms. So, I guess in terms of this being sort of like the younger generation and this sort of working out towards their favor, it seems like this would be something that would be, in the positive direction of things.
Yeah, because like I actually really appreciated that they didn't spend too long teasing it and stuff like that. I think too many shows do that, where like they just tease a relationship, and then last episode they get together and you never see any of them as a couple, which is the dynamic I think most fans want to see. Whereas I'm kind of like, yeah, that's just fine. Yeah, go for it. I think it was kind of obvious from earlier scenes and episodes that this was probably the direction that they were going to go. It fits kind of thematically, as you say, with what they're going for, with it being this sort of relationship across the border, basically, type thing of like human and an elf. And it fits both characters in terms of Callum, who loves everything about Zadia, and Rayla, who's grown to, like, I suppose, gain an appreciation for human stuff along the way. So it's, I think, a very sort of symbolic relationship for the show, and I think the dynamic that they have works as well, with the sort of awkward back and forths they can have, but they can also really sort of inspire each other. And yeah, it was interesting here to have, obviously her kiss him, and he's just so like confused and taken by surprise that like she kind of initiated this, that like even though he's kind of for it, he was just so taken by surprise that the mood changed from like her crying thinking all is gone to suddenly romance relationship. It's just such a mood swing. He's like, what happened? And it just takes them, obviously, the gap basically over the course of the next episode before they properly realize how they feel. But yeah, I like how it was done. With regards to the rest of the episode, this is when some of the big kind of political stuff goes down. We see Kasef return and give an ultimatum to Ezran that if he won't have Katalis go to war against Zadia, then the other human nations who have all allied together will go to war against Katalis. And this forces Ezran to make a really tough choice. Either way, a war of some form is coming, and he has to make a huge, tough decision between basically which war to have. And this is when the advisor guy, who's obviously been plotting stuff in the background, goes to talk to Ezran in secret, and then obviously off screen a lot of stuff happens, and so we see Ezran go to the baker with all the tart stuff to tell him, you take care of Bait when stuff goes down. And basically what happens here is Ezran abdicates the throne on the condition that there will be no war between the human empires, and that soldiers from Katalis who don't want to fight are allowed to lay down their arms and stay out of the battle, and like basically not put themselves at risk. This is ultimately agreed to, and we see the swap basically. Ezran is put in jail, Viren is freed. I thought they did an okay job at this. I suppose just kind of logically, politically, I'm not entirely sure how they managed to get like Viren is freed included in this deal. In that, like, it just felt a little bit like unexplained how everyone was suddenly like okay with Viren because he's a good leader, that he's immediately allowed to jump as far as to be the king again after the sort of crimes he committed. Like, he killed a bunch of people last season and stuff like that. But other than that, I think it was explained relatively well, and you can't blame Ezran too much for what he did. It fits his personality and his ideals perfectly, the way things went. But what are your thoughts on this, Ezran stepping down from the throne here?
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely fits Ezra's sort of character as far as taking, I guess, sort of like the path that he, at least initially, would think to have like sort of the least sort of consequences. I mean, in the end, I mean, he has to know that they're still going to go to war and that Viren's still going to figure out some way to sort of take control of things. So, it's, I don't know. I mean, his whole idea was just sort of, the forces that they would sort of lose in the battle with the other human nations, even though that they're sort of like better trained forces, is still, there's still going to be a lot of, life lost regardless. And, eventually by the end of the season, we do see, a good amount of that happens sort of regardless, especially when everyone's sort of transformed and stuff. So I don't know. I think, the way that they're doing the political stuff here is, I mean, they do, like you said, they do cut out a good amount of it, which, sort of makes it sort of curious how is sort of what the actual sort of deal was. I mean, we know Prince Kasuf sort of met with Viren, so we know that there's, some colluding there, that, of course just leads to them all sort of battling later on. So I don't know. I mean, I think it fits Ezra's character, and what sort of happens sort of like makes sense. But I don't know. Maybe I don't know. The only thing I'm thinking of is like maybe they just sort of didn't publicize as much of sort of like Viren's sort of like wrongs doings that sort of more of the people were still sort of for him. At least I guess sort of in the court per se, rather than sort of I guess sort of the common people. So I don't know. It's definitely interesting how they chose to go about doing this sort of back end sort of dealing of things.
Mm-hmm. Only other thing to note about this episode is we do get this, I think it's 2 scenes where we see Aravos as the bug creating this sort of like web over one of Viren's eyes, and then once it's done, Viren is now able to see the spirit of Aravos and talk to him kind of more easily. But that's all we get in the episode. So we move on to episode 5, Heroes and Masterminds. I suppose we'll start with Soren actually take some of his action here. He decides to free Ezran because he sees Ezran as being the true king and that he'll support Ezran just like he supported Harrow before. That he sort of failed Harrow, he's not going to fail Ezran as the new king. And we see that others are still loyal to Ezran, so we see Corvus, Opeli, the baker guy, and Soren, of course. They all still support Ezran, and by the end of the episode we get that they've called in Fifi, they've called Eugene so that Fifi can bring Ezran to Zadia so he can reunite with Callum and like assist them and stuff like that. So, I suppose it ultimately is safer for Ezran to be away from all this kind of political craziness going on, and it's better for him to just rejoin up with Callum with what's going on. I really like this. Again, it was nice to see Soren taking some kind of good sort of leadership action, and you sort of see that in many ways he kind of works. He's better kind of in a way like on his own, like not supporting his father. You kind of begin to see the potential that he has. It's just the unfortunate thing of him having to basically betray his sister as well in all of this. But I like the depth that adds, and it was just cool to see the clear, these are the characters who still support Ezran. They did a good job at getting across why they all kind of care for him. And then, of course, Fifi, Ezran is the animal kind of character that we've seen so many times. Perfect animal to bring Ezran back into play very, very quickly. But what were your thoughts on the Ezran stuff in this episode?
Yeah, no, I think the way that they sort of set up sort of like his sort of like initial meeting back up with Bait, and then sort of like, the whole sort of escape plot with Soren, which, even though, his plan, needs a bit of sort of, I guess, modification to sort of get Ezran out, he definitely, he still completes sort of like his mission, and, it seems like he has things pretty sort of planned out as far as, helping sort of like the end sort of situation. And of course, he knows about sort of the Dragon's Inn and everything, so, he can see sort of, I guess, sort of the importance of, allowing Ezran to sort of, continue on in this journey, and, maybe it might have some sort of, bigger ramifications that even he might not be sort of aware of. But no, it's good to see, even though there aren't, that many characters that are sort of on Ezra's side, it's nice to see, the ones that do support him, and how that comes back to play out in sort of like later episodes. I think is definitely nice to see this sort of setup here and to see where it follows.
Yeah, and especially with like a character like Opeli, I was really worried that Viren would just like have her killed or something like that, because it seemed like she
Hmm.
was like the most outspoken one against him. So it was like, okay, good, you're escaping too. So like Ezran's gonna have some support when he kind of gets the throne back eventually. Um, the other thing here is so we see Viren, after being freed, immediately takes the throne again. There's some opposition, but of course eventually it is settled. He is going to be the king again. And we see the main scene here is that he speaks to his soldiers, and he prepares them. He gets them all riled up for the attack on Zadia, but he does have to agree to, obviously, like Ezran's last kind of request as king, which was that anyone who doesn't want to fight is allowed to lay down their arms. So we get a few of the soldiers put down their swords and leave, because of course you can get the impression they really don't want to support Viren in what he's doing primarily, but that also they can tell that there's been some sort of political maneuverings going on here. They're still loyal to Ezran. So the main guy we get here is, I think his name is Marcos, is the first one to put down his sword, and a few others follow suit. And you get the impression from Viren's reaction that it's more have like deserted him than he thought, and he has them all wear this badge that sort of shows off that they're deserters. It's a symbol that will highlight that. And he just in his speech definitely tries to get the loyalty of the rest of his army by pointing out that, look, these cowards are leaving, like they're following like the cowards king's like orders and stuff like that. So um I thought the voice actor did a really good job at getting across a little bit of the sort of sarcasm and stuff like that, very much insulting of Ezran's kind of last act as king. It was a really good kind of speech, I think, from the kind of villain's perspective. But what were your thoughts on Viren's speech?
Yeah, no, I think, the way that he set things up to sort of, let the characters, let the ones who didn't want to sort of join the fight and, sort of still sort of, keep the main, sort of group that was sort of all for the battle, I think was definitely, it's well played on his part. You can see, how he's been, involved in political affairs for a while here, so he knew sort of like the right things to say, and to see the characters who sort of like, sort of left the battle, like you mentioned, the first character. So it's interesting to see him from like, the beginning of season one, to see, where, him and his sort of, ideas, because he's been spared before. So he doesn't really sort of, see sort of, the purpose of what they're sort of doing here. So I thought that was definitely interesting. And just even like, Varen holding up sort of like the badge that, later on comes into play, which I didn't even, notice the first time. I think it's really cool how they sort of set that up.
Yeah, and then like you don't see it in this episode, but obviously like those soldiers don't just like stay with their family. Like it forms this sort of secondary army, like led by Corvus, Opeli, and stuff like that that will come into play later on. It's pretty well done, I think, the setup here definitely. Uh, Other section of this episode, of course, from the previous episode, is Nyx has stolen Zim in all of this, and has just left them at the Oasis, so she's heading for the Dragon Queen. They follow her, but they have to wait until daytime to do it because of the soul serpents or whatever they're called. Um, that's why it's so dangerous to cross this desert. And basically, when they catch up to her and begin to kind of crawl up the Ambler, then we get the proper reveal that, like, oh yeah, how did we forget that she has wings? She can just like hold Zim and fly off. But of course, Zim has learned to use his lightning kind of breath attack, so he ends up sort of shocking her wings and bringing her down to the ground. But this is where Rayla again demonstrates how much of a hero she is. She steps up, saves Nyx from the snakes, and they do manage to save her, gets Zim back, and they're on more friendly terms after this with Nyx, because they saved her, and they realize like she's not that much of a threat. She is just this sort of trickster character, and once they keep their eyes open, she's actually fairly okay. So in the aftermath of this, Callum of course says some more complimentary things about Rayla, that she is a hero, that's who she is. This time, Callum kisses Rayla. It seems like it's going to be another awkward moment, but reversed. But they actually do kiss, and this is where their relationship properly, starts here. They are from this point on a couple, and it's just nice to see. I think that it's cool that for a few episodes we just have them as a couple. Their dynamic changes a little bit. They're closer now, and I think it works. I do think it really works. And it was an interesting way to do it, like with some of the like teasing lines from Nyx about their relationship and so on. But overall, I think it's really good that they did this. But what are your thoughts on the Nyx stuff in this episode?
Yeah, I think it's cool to see how I guess this sort of part sort of resolves and how they sort of get the character that was sort of trying to trick them initially sort of more or less on their side. She does sort of give them a bit of advice later on that would have helped if I guess they paid attention to when they finally do get to the mountain. So yeah, no, it's nice to see their Cal and Marilla's sort of dynamic here, how it blossoms into their relationship here, and how that was even by this character could sort of like hint at that even from the beginning, and how that does sort of happen by the end of it. I think is nice, and just sort of to see just sort of them sort of I guess more confident sort of on their journey here after they were having a bit of an issue before. I think it's nice to see.
Mm-hmm. Then we move on to episode 6, which is called Thunderstruck, and this probably is my favorite episode because I think the flashback is really well done here. And effectively the way this happens is that Viren leads the march of his troops into Zadia, and on the long horse ride to Zadia, Arvos basically just comes out and says, like, I've been meaning to ask you for a while. I hear that you are the one who came up with the plan to kill and succeed in killing Avazandum, which is revealed to be the name of Thunder, the king of the dragons. And this is where we basically get Viren telling the story of how they went about killing Avazandum. So this links into the backstory that we got last season, with them going to get the core of that lava golem thing to heat up the land so they could have food. And then Avazandum took revenge by, of course, killing the 3 queens. And this is the revenge against that. You sort of see the cycle of revenge building up. And of course, season 1 started with the revenge from Zadia for that by killing Harrow. So it's just getting that across. But here's what happens is basically that Harrow is still sort of in mourning about what happened to Sarai, and Viren urges Harrow to seek revenge, but he doesn't really want to. He kind of points out that he has this plan, this dark magic spell. He reveals that when Sarai died, because Viren was there, Harrow wasn't, Viren managed to capture Sarai's dying breath in a jar, and that this will be the key to the spell, and that Claudia has just recently come across the horn of a unicorn. And so the 3 elements for this spell that will kill Avazandum is the dying breath of someone, the horn of a unicorn, and then the undying hatred of the one who loved the victim who the dying breath came from. So eventually, after some kind of basically manipulating, like purposefully getting Harrow upset and remembering all the bad things in the past, Harrow gets upset enough to agree to it, and we see him give over some of his blood for the spell. And I think they did a really good job at getting across the kind of change in mood of Harrow, that he was willing to sort of almost like let this be the end of it, that there's a certain amount of peace in the aftermath of what's happened, but it's just Viren's kind of poking and prodding basically that continues on the cycle. So I really like this first section, but what were your thoughts on this, Viren urging him to seek revenge?
Yeah, Viren does a really good job of sort of just, bringing up sort of, just sort of feelings that Harrow has and that, he has as well, for the Queen, and just sort of, how, she really did give up everything to sort of make, to let them live and to just sort of, help sort of accomplish their, I guess, sort of their initial sort of mission here. So with all that going back and forth, it definitely, pushes Harlow just sort of over the edge, that sort of gets him to sort of, concede to sort of go with this plot, which, like you said, he really did seem like he was, you can say him as a character as he is one that sort of can see, generally can see both sides of things, but, definitely, for ones that he sort of really cares about, that's sort of like his sort of tipping point as a character, as it is for most sort of characters. So it's nice to see that sort of, back and forth that he has, sort of deciding on what he's actually sort of going to do.
Yeah, because like you go back to season one, and you definitely got the impression from him that like he knew that the revenge against this was coming back then, and that he was pretty much prepared to die because of what happened here. And yeah, the Viren kind of manipulation I thought was really well done. Like it was already sort of bad enough him bringing it up, and then especially when he started to talk about the kids and that like um she never got the chance to see the kids grow up. They never got the chance to grow up with her, and that's what really pushed him over the edge. It's like in the same way that Viren is ultimately using his own children to further his goals here, he's sort of using Harrow's kids to manipulate Harrow to do something here. But I think it's a good kind of good characterization for a manipulative character like Viren. Um, so they head out, just the two of them, Viren and Harrow. Obviously they've attached the horn of the unicorn with the spell that Viren did onto Sarai's spear. And this is what they're going to use to kill Avzandam. So when they go out to the border, they find that Thunder isn't protecting the border. Instead, he's way back at his lair, the Stormspire, and it seems like he's protecting something. And he comes out and it kind of is acting a little different. He offers them the opportunity to just leave, that he doesn't want to kill on this day, that on a day of life he doesn't want to kill. And this at this point Viren basically figures it out, but Harrow chooses this as the moment to basically rush into action. So as he rushes in, it seems like Thunder is just about to kill Harrow because he's so big and massive. And this is when Viren uses dark magic to sort of hold Thunder in place. This gives Harrow the opportunity to throw the spear. He hits him right in the center, and basically the curse just spreads over his body, and Avzandam turns to stone as he tries to return home. You see a tear in his eye, and it becomes clear, of course, at this point he was protecting the Dragon Prince, the egg, which was back at their lair. And in the aftermath of this, Viren just again urges Harrow to let him go and destroy the egg, and Harrow reluctantly allows Viren to do this. So this sort of catches us up with most of the sort of history of like the key events that have happened just before the series, and I thought it was really, really well done. I thought there was great emotion for Harrow, but then they also had made you feel good emotion for like Avzandam as like it all begins to come together of like, okay, this is how he died. He was actually just protecting the egg and stuff like that. So what were your thoughts on this important scene?
Yeah, no, they did do a good job of getting both sides across as far as, not wanting to be sort of in this battle on the day of life from Thunder, and just sort of from, Harlow just sort of at this point sort of being blinded by sort of revenge, and that sort of, making this battle sort of, start out the way it sort of did here. And, it's sort of, I guess, sort of unfortunate how, this is like, the cycle that they're always sort of talking about that just sort of goes back and forth and is, pretty hard to sort of break. So no, I think they definitely did a good job of just showing, I think, both sides having, some compassion, and then just sort of throwing Viren into the mix, which is just sort of, I guess, sort of messing up just sort of everything, sort of, trying to push things, sort of just towards the more, the wrong way of things.
And it also helps to like make it clear that like, okay, so Viren went on his own to get the egg. That's how he sort of had possession of it at like the start of the series, and we'll find out the exact specific scene in like an episode or two here. Um, the other sections of this episode are that after this, Aravos kind of just talks about how happy he is at the death of Avazandum, and he reveals here that it was actually Avazandum who trapped him wherever he is. And we get some details here that Aravos doesn't actually know where he is imprisoned, but they do note that like it's this actually quite nice looking room, but he is trapped in it, and he has been trapped there for hundreds of years. Um, this is when they arrive at the breach and they find out that it's been destroyed. Claudia reveals she has the dragon horn that they got from the dragon in season 2, and they're going to use that with some dark magic to get through, which Viren does. He basically parts the lava using his staff, and they cross over to the Sun Elf side of things. So pretty cool stuff, but I think the main thing to talk about there is definitely the extra bits of info on Aravos that we get. What are your thoughts on that? Finding out that it was the King of the Dragons who was the one who imprisoned him, like the fact that Aravos doesn't know where he's imprisoned and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that definitely adds a nice sort of layer of information that we weren't really sort of clear on. I mean, I think there's still a lot of stuff about Avros that we still don't really get, and by the end of the season, there's even, I guess, maybe a couple more sort of questions or so. But no, I mean, it did look like he was sort of banished, but even though it does look like a good place is probably like some place that's sort of either, I don't know, really obscure or just sort of locked away, or some sort of magical type place, which is, I guess, is sort of what you're sort of led to sort of believe anyway. But it's interesting just to get the idea of who put him there and that he's been there for quite a long while. So clearly, Erebos has some sort of history that, of course, we're probably eventually going to find out, and sort of that sort of idea, which it seems like he's definitely against Xadior for his own sort of personal self-interest, which sort of just leads to the whole idea of him supporting Viren in the first place.
Yeah, and this is where you always have to go back to, I think it was season 1, where like Viren went to look up information on him, and all the stuff in the books about him just disappears, and that like they are teasing like what crime, I suppose, effectively he committed that the King of the Dragons imprisoned him for. Other things we see: Callum, Rayla, and Zim arrive at the stone remains of Avazandum here. This is as Ezran arrives on Fifi. We do get Fifi actually dying here. It's basically she dies from exhaustion, and I think Ezran also says that she's sick as well. Um, but basically, as she dies, she transforms into a feather, and at this point they realize that, oh yeah, she's a moon phoenix. So when the time is right, that feather will form into like a newly born moon phoenix, and Fifi will be reborn again. So that was a cool reveal to see that, yeah, these are magical creatures. So of course we can have an actual phoenix doing the reborn from the feather thing. Um, and then there's an interesting scene here where obviously there's a lot of emotion in the air, as of course the characters stand next to the remains of Avazandum, and they just sort of note all the connections here, that that's my mother's spear, that my dad threw at him. This is what caused like the cycle of revenge. And you see Ezran reunited with Zim, and it's this interesting scene where it's like almost like the first time you realize that both of the fathers of like Zim and and Zim and Ezran, like they were like enemies like just like a bit ago, like that's what we just found out about. But here the sons are actually friends, this sort of generational thing, not just keeping the actions of like your fathers and stuff like that, and doing things differently. It's all very interesting, and like Callum just notes how he has very confused opinions about all of this, and that he kind of notes that like we did some bad stuff, but also like they killed my mother. How am I meant to feel about all of this? I thought it was a nice scene of just pointing out that like, yeah, these are some weird connections here, but it's also sort of very kind of symbolic about where we're heading. But what were your thoughts on these scenes here around the stone remains of the King of the Dragons?
Yeah, no, I thought that was definitely a pretty sort of, I guess, impactful moment just for Callum, just sort of, understanding all these connections, sort of, really sort of, speaking on the cycle of revenge, which is just, of course, the sort of main crux of the issue of everything, and just sort of how that's sort of going back and forth, and just sort of, how is one able to sort of finally sort of let that go, since, his stepdad, wasn't able to sort of let that go, with the prodding of Varen, of course. How should he sort of feel in the situation where, you do have the comparison, the juxtaposition of, Zim sort of chasing Ezran around and sort of having fun. So, it's like you're just sort of like hoping for better for, the next, current generation. And that moment there is, it's interesting to see sort of Callum in this sort of moment of sort of, not really knowing what to do and having Rayla sort of comfort him in this situation versus last time it was the other way around.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder, like how long will it take Zim for him to like mature to the point where like he can talk and like communicate
Yeah.
properly? What will he actually say and think of everything once he understands it? And like how does like maturity with the dragons actually like work? And that like Zim's only been alive a little bit, but like are we viewing this as like an animal where it like matures quite quickly, or is it going to take even longer? Because they got across I think at some point earlier on that it like there's only an egg from storm dragons every like hundreds of years, so um, it's hard to judge, but like it's interesting stuff to think about definitely. But we move on to chapter 7, which is called Heart of Cinder, and yeah, this one is very focused here. It's just all set up for what Viren does here with the Sun Elves. Um, we just have him again being very dismissive of Soren at the start of the episode. Aravos kind of making it clear that like this is the plan ultimately. We want to take out the Dragon Queen, capture Zim, and I'll teach you how to like harness the power of a dragon so you can empower yourself. Uh, but we do see some confliction from Viren here as like Arvos is like, oh, so like your goal of course has to be conquering Zadia, but Viren is like, no, I just want humanity to flourish, and Arvos is like, so we have to conquer Zadia to make that happen, and ultimately Viren has to admit that to get what he wants done, conquering Zadia is the way he has to make that happen. But it was just interesting that this discussion even had to happen in the first place. That Viren isn't fully, you know, all out and out villainous. That he still cares for Claudia at the very least and cares about his species, but there's definitely a lot of issues going on here. So the first thing they're going to do is attack the stronghold of the Sun Elves, but Viren is actually going to do this on his own, so as to not risk much of their forces. So basically, Viren allows himself to get captured by the Sun Elves, and he's brought into the fortress here, Lux Aria, and he basically gets in by informing them that I know about what happened to Queen Aditi, which is revealed to be the grandmother of the current queen, and this is the only reason why she, who hates humans, wants to hear from him. They're going to use the light again to decide if Viren is trustworthy. This reveals Viren's dark magic form, and they realize that, okay, he can't be trusted, but what we're going to do is we're going to use the Sun Forge to purify him. At this point, Janai goes to Amaya to tell her what's happening, and Amaya just warns Janai that Viren is insanely dangerous, and this is more or less the point at which we get across the idea that these two do truly trust each other, and Janai basically lets Amaya out at this point to help. But I suppose we'll discuss about stuff up to there. What are your thoughts on the first section of this episode, the sort of planning and this surprising tactic of just sending Viren in on his own to the Sun Elves?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, the planning part of it, I mean, I think it's really just sort of, just sort of set up just as far as like a whole sort of trap, which sort of Amaya sort of, hints in by the end of this section here. So I think it's interesting to see how, Eros has this sort of plan in mind, and he knows sort of, he knows enough about, I guess, sort of Zadia and just sort of the people here in order to sort of, get them to manipulate to even sort of let a human sort of into their area here, and to see Viren apparently have some bit of humanity left here. It's interesting just the way that they choose to show that here, because we can see before that he does have he still does think of Claudia as sort of like someone who he can sort of like relate to and will sort of protect here, even though it seems like he's willing to pretty much go to almost sort of any lengths here. But that's sort of about the limit that we really see up until this point here. So it's nice to see that sort of contrast here. But definitely by the end of things, you definitely see that he goes a bit too far, which many might say he already sort of went that way. But no, I think it's interesting just to see the layout of the land finally here. I think them sort of traveling across with the army here, and just them, and as well as Cal and Morella, it helps to sort of get an idea of, I guess, the larger scope of the world, which up until now we didn't really sort of get.
Next thing that happens is that they bring him to the Sun Forge, and they basically say that the Sun Forge will remove all of the parts of Viren that dark magic has affected, with the idea, I think, being here that like it will basically kill him because he's been using dark magic so much. This is when like Amaya is freed at this point. There's an interesting line from the Queen here, what she says to Viren, that like you couldn't have been, you can't be happy with what you were given, like saying that like on like a species level. I thought it kind of linked a little bit into the opening scene of the season with regards to like humans by default aren't linked to magic, and then she's almost suggesting that there is something that humans were given or something like that. But either way, as Viren's about to be killed, Aravos comes out of Viren, takes control of the Sun Forge by taking possession of the elf guy who had the magic staff. He does actually call Viren his vessel at this point, which was interesting that like Viren didn't really make any note of that at any point. But Aravos like whispers in the ear of the Queen, I assume it's the truth about what happened to her grandmother, and then just kills her there and then. So the Queen of the Sun Elves gone right there. Amaya and Janai are basically just arriving at the Sun Forge, and they see this happen, and it's this devastating moment for Janai, and Amaya eventually convinces Janai that they have to sort of flee, that the Sun Elves fortress has been lost. They just have to get everyone they can and flee away from there to regroup. This was like a big kind of plot point. Just everything happened all of a sudden, with like Aravos acting, a kind of noted character being killed. What were your thoughts on what was going on here?
Yeah, no, it definitely seemed like they were moving things, pretty quick at this point. Like once he sort of like sprung the trap and sort of had control of the other sort of Sun Forge elf, it definitely seemed like things were just sort of, moving towards his sort of way here, and just, getting to see sort of Avros sort of, I guess, visible to everyone else in the area. It was interesting to see, how, he just sort of played everyone, and just sort of, I don't know, I think it definitely gives you more into on his character and the way that he sort of is viewing things and is going to act, later on with everything that does happen, eventually.
And what were your thoughts on the fact that like he whispers in the Queen's ear just before killing her? Did you assume it was just what they mentioned earlier on about what happened to Queen Aditi or whatever?
I don't know. That's what I would think automatically. But no, I'm not necessarily sure. It didn't. I don't know. It wasn't a lot of reaction from her until he sort of just burned her off the edge there, which was pretty interesting to see how they sort of chose to go about sort of ending her reign here.
Yeah, because like initially I was thinking about it. It's like grandmother, she seems fairly young, but then I'm like, oh wait, they're elves, of course, so they can like live for hundreds
Yeah.
of years. So even though Aravos has been imprisoned for hundreds of years, it would make sense that he could have been the main villain in an incident that happened about 1,000 years ago. So that actually ends up kind of like actually working out that Okay, so they're teasing like this is the next bit of history that's kind of important, is what Aravos actually did and how that affected Zadia in the past and so on. So I assume we'll learn about that soon enough. Um, the other stuff that happens here is that they arrive at the Stormspire. Rayla, Callum, Ezran, and Zim, and so on. So this is the lair of the Dragon Queen here. And as they get up, like it's this huge, huge mountain, they basically begin to run out of air as they get closer to the top, and they go through this arch that basically, gives them a little bit of a riddle. Uh, Eventually, the dragon from last season, who got his horn cut off, arrives to help, and actually tells Ezran the kind of spell that they need to do to make this happen, which is Ventus Spiralis, which Callum is able to use since he has the Sky Arcanum, and this basically allows him to breathe up really, really high. So it's also at around this point that Ezran actually finds out that Rayla and Callum are a couple, and he has a pretty good reaction to it. It's just like jaw wide open, and it's just like he's unable to believe that it's happened, but he seems fairly happy about it. And yeah, at the top of the mountain, they meet a sky elf who reveals that they're too late, and we sort of end the episode on a bit of a cliffhanger. Well, because it's Netflix, it's not that much of a cliffhanger. But yeah, did you have any thoughts on this? The ascent up the Stormspire here, the little bit of a riddle with the spell and stuff like that.
No, that was a nice little touch. I mean, the fact that Nick sort of hinted at sort of the hard breathing on the mountain and that sort of what happens here, I think it's a nice touch to sort of connect it together here, and how it just happens to be that Callum can use sort of Sky Arcanum, that he's able to actually do the spell. Otherwise, there would be no way for them to sort of ascend the mountain, because they just wouldn't have the means to do it here. I thought was just nice how that sort of all sort of worked out here.
Mm-hmm. And then the final part of this episode is Viren returning from the action on the Sunforge, and he looks completely evil here when he returns. He talks about how he has the power to defeat Zadia. He will make them immune to fire, and he basically has this plan to alter the entire army in some way. And he says that Soren will be the first. Soren refuses, saying that he's afraid. And this is when Kasif steps up. He'll be the first one to get changed. So Viren gives the power of sun power. I don't know the specific terminology here, but he basically gives Kasif the same magical ability that the Sunfire Elves have, which is to basically sun magic that empowers them and makes them immune to fire. But it's turned Kasif into this sort of monstrous looking like kind of, he doesn't change too much, but you can definitely tell he's been completely altered here. This is when after this Viren changes the rest of the army, but in between we get a very important scene here where Soren decides that because of this he has to leave now, and unfortunately that means he has to say goodbye to Claudia because she refuses to leave her father. And it's a really good scene from Soren here, kind of explaining why he can't be a part of this, and he does leave Claudia on just a note that I think you should come with me too. You're beginning to become too much like our father, and I can't agree with what he's doing. I don't want that to happen to you, basically. So unfortunately, brother and sister here have to part ways. It's a very emotional scene, but it gets across the idea of just the loyalty that Claudia has to her father is something that's going to be pretty important as we go forward. I think we saw that last season as well, and I like that we finally saw Soren kind of make the choice to separate himself here. It was a big moment for him, and I thought it was a great character moment. But what are your thoughts on Viren here, the changing the army, and then the big Soren scene?
Yeah, that was pretty sort of crazy how he just sort of, was able to sort of manipulate it and just sort of transform the whole sort of army, which I don't know, makes me wonder if that gives him more sort of control over them as well. I don't know, it seems like whenever characters turn into sort of the monstrous type character, automatically making the bad guy, that, they sort of lose a bit of themselves. I think for Prince Caliph, and especially with what happens to him by the end of the season, it definitely seems like he loses himself completely, which I guess is just sort of, his inner sort of, rage and revenge sort of just sort of taking over his character. Because I think, he does have a pretty sort of strong sort of like, change in his character just as far as overall sort of like enhancement versus like what we've seen with the elves and how, they're sort of just more so sort of like enhanced versus him, his body does sort of, disform and is sort of like enlarged a bit. But no, I mean, that whole sort of thing is interesting, especially when, Claudia and Soren are sort of eventually sort of forced to sort of break up and how, she, laments that this is sort of like a choice that she had to sort of make before with their mother and sort of how that sort of, turned things out. And, I don't know. I mean, I like that Soren, at this point, he's finally, he's really able to see that this isn't the place that he needs to sort of be at, that, he really needs to go on his own. I mean, I don't know, it makes me wonder for Claudia, with everything that happens in this season, I know we seem to always go back and forth with her character and sort of what side she's going to take and what would it, if ever, be enough to sort of push her over the edge, which it seems we still haven't gotten to that point, if ever.
Mm-hmm. After this, we move on to episode 8, which is called Dragon Guard. So this sky elf at the top of the mountain reveals that his name is Ibis, and that he says that the Dragon Queen, Zubeia is her name, has been asleep for 10 days. She hasn't opened her eyes, and she's in this deep slumber that he basically explains is because of a broken heart, because Avazandum is dead, and then Zim was taken, presumed killed, and stuff like that. So they go in, they get to meet the sleeping Dragon Queen here. We see the empty nest, which of course doesn't have the egg in it, of course, and there's no sign of her waking. After this, Rayla runs away because, of course, her parents were part of the Dragon Guard, who were basically meant to be that last line of defense for the Dragon King and Queen. And up as far as she's aware, they back in season 1, I think she said to Callum that they betrayed their post. They just like abandoned the Queen, and that's why whatever happened happened. So that's why she's so upset about kind of finally being at the place where her parents, a parent betrayal kind of type thing happened. And she talks about this to Callum and just says that it hurts her to be here, to have to see all of this. And I think this is an interesting one because like the reveal comes out at the end of the episode. We'll get to it. And it again is another thing that kind of highlights. But who sent this information back to the Moonshadow Elves that they betrayed their post? Like, did someone just go up there and be like, "Oh, they're not here," so they must have abandoned them? And that like they could have been killed in some way. Like if someone that powerful kind of went up there, like just the idea like that the information was immediately that, oh, they must have betrayed their post. So that's something that the Moonshadow Elves need to work on. But what were your thoughts on these kind of opening sequences here, getting to see the Dragon Queen for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reveal was definitely, cool to see sort of how, how cool and sad as far as just sort of, the result of everything that sort of has happened here and how, they try to sort of, make a connection with her to sort of get her up and just to see, how Zim's not quite ready to sort of, see his mom in this sort of capacity just because of, I don't know, Zim is such a, I mean, we don't know like his exact age or how that sort of relates to him being dragon, but he is just recently sort of hatched. So just him, it seems like it's a bit sort of, overwhelming for him, and just to see, Rayla, come back with all these sort of feelings from what has happened before with her parents, or at least what they think they know of her parents. It's just sort of, it's interesting to see all these emotions sort of come back out after, they had been, slightly, at a better place previously.
Mm-hmm. Some other stuff happens here. Soren arrives at the spire and begins to head up. As he begins to run out of air, like happened to everyone else before, the dragon that, of course, he had the big confrontation with appears, and he thinks, oh, what's happening here? But, of course, it's Ezran on the back. They just fly him up to the top, and like Callum uses the spell on him so he can breathe again. and he informs them about what exactly is happening with Viren. So this is an important sort of like plot thing that like they become aware at this point that there is an invading army coming, of course to attack the Queen and like get Zim back. So they become aware that the final battle is basically coming, and Soren has warned them about it here. Um, we get Callum talking to Ibis, who reveals that, like, I think what does he say? Only about 1 in 10 Sky Elves have wings, but if you are a Sky Elf mage, there is this spell, Manus Pluma Volantis, where you can sprout wings using kind of runes that you draw on your arms, and he reveals that that's what he has, and this is a really cool thing for Callum. He'd like to have this. He has sky magic, and he reveals to Ibis here that like, oh, I have an Arcanum. Again, we get the reaction of like, a human who has an Arcanum. That's unheard of. Getting across how unique that is once again. And Rayla has decided that she will stay to fight to do what her parents should have long ago. That before she finds out the truth, she's determined to be like, it's this interesting thing of like Callum can't agree with her on this, of like she feels she has to stay and kind of die with honor and like basically do that almost like for her parents to like regain like the honor of their family or something like that. And Callum doesn't really like that at all. She doesn't like that Callum can't understand, so this is the first little kind of rift since they've got together as a couple. um I suppose we'll just discuss it up to here, but what are your thoughts on some of this stuff here, kind of set up for some of the action scenes later on?
Yeah, I mean, just getting, I guess, more of the internal or just sort of external sort of conflict that Rayla has with things, and just sort of, seeing how Callum tries to sort of like understand it while still saying that, there might possibly be sort of like a better way, with the advice that he sort of was given as far as, how to deal with this sort of, imposing sort of army that's coming. Because, I mean, there it doesn't, with them just being such a small sort of force as of now of what we currently know, it doesn't really seem like they have much of a chance here. So, it's interesting how that sort of is being sort of brought up again to the forefront here, and just, Callum just sort of, showing more just sort of the idea of him having sort of, magic, and how, that's, of course, is going to come into play later on. So, yeah, they do quite a bit of setup here for things that are going to come, pretty quickly. So it is a setup, but it's like a really fast setup, which is probably pretty good since this is the end of, the season.
This is when Callum uses a moon spell. So Rayla gives Callum the kind of moon opal necklace that Athari had given her, because of course she thinks she's going to die basically in this battle. So Callum basically uses that necklace to do a bit of moon magic, the same one that Lujane used before to sort of show them something from the past. And so this is where Callum sees basically what happened in the past with Rayla's parents on the day that the egg was taken. So he draws what he sees, and then like we get it's interesting the way they kind of choose to show this, of like showing us some of it at the start, then we see Callum bring the book over to Rayla to like relay the story to her, but we see it here anyway. So Rayla's parents were there. They were actually told to leave and basically not sacrifice their lives, but they specifically do choose to stay. This is when Viren comes in to get the egg, and he fights with Rayla's parents. He traps them both with magic kind of in ice, and then basically has them watch as he's about to destroy the egg. Rayla's mother then actually urges him to be like, why don't you take the egg instead of destroying it? You're a dark mage. The potential of that egg could be incredible someday if you need to do something. And he decides that that's actually good advice, and he takes the egg. And so Rayla has a complete sort of change of heart, finding out about this, that her parents didn't abandon their post and actually were clever enough to sort of manipulate the villain into allowing the egg to still be present, basically to stop him from destroying it. And it's a kind of complete role reversal. Again, doesn't speak too well of the the Moon Shadow Elves and their information gathering skills, but they Rayla has the information that she needs. I like that they brought up again Callum's drawing skills here to be able to show this to Rayla, in that the proof for Rayla is that, of course, he's able to draw what Rayla's parents look like, having never seen them before. So very, very cool kind of moment here. So what are your thoughts on the truth kind of being revealed here about Rayla's parents?
Yeah, I think it's definitely cool the way that they chose to do it, and sort of like the half moon elf sort of flashback, and then giving like the full view of the actual sort of like flashback. I think this season does a really good job of, bringing all that sort of past history to the forefront with sort of these, these flashbacks. So I think that's definitely a good plus of them actually sort of, showing what actually happened in the past rather than just sort of relaying the story through sort of other means here. But no, I think it's nice to see sort of really a sort of reaction to, her parents, not actually leaving the post. So you actually see in the flashback one of the other elves actually leave the post, just thinking that is sort of that the whole sort of situation is sort of hopeless here, which I don't know, they might have actually been better off if they had more elves, because I mean, you do see them get like a bit of a leg up on Varen in the sort of like initial fight here, but him and his dark magic is able to sort of help him sort of win the situation here. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely a good way of showing this sort of story.
Yeah, I suppose from that point of view, it is a bit of a weird one about like why that guy panicked so much, and that like, did they think a full army was coming? Like, could they not just look down and see that like it's just two guys and only one of them's coming? Like, like was there need for that much panic? But obviously, they probably realized that like, okay, he's using dark magic. It's if it's powerful enough to kill the king, that's probably why it is the case. But yeah, either way, really cool scene. Final scene of this episode is that Soren talks about his dad and says that he now understands that all the sort of manipulation he did in the past, that he is a villain. He uses the word villain, and that his speech basically urges them all to stay and fight. And this is when the remaining Sun Elves and Amaya arrive, and Ibis and Ezran kind of leave to go get some help, with the idea that Ezran is sort of teasing that he's going off to get more dragons. So we have the good army basically arriving here, which is cool to see, because otherwise it was like a handful of them there, and like only like one or two of them are actually fighters. It was not going to go very well. But what are your thoughts on the very end of this episode?
Yeah, no, I don't know, I think it's cool to see sort of the group sort of all come back together here, and to see, it looks like, they actually have, some sort of help, because, like you said before, it wasn't really looking like this was going to turn out pretty well in this sort of situation here. So, I think it's nice to see just sort of the set of characters sort of all come back together, and to see, where, even though there's not like a huge chance of success that we could potentially see. The fact that Ezran is going off, he is going to get some other forces, and we see how that eventually helps or not helps later on. I think I don't know. I think they definitely moved things really fast in this episode.
Mm-hmm. And then yeah, after that we move on to episode 9, which is called The Final Battle. And yeah, this is tons of action here. It's just lots of scenes of like just stuff happening. And before the actual fight begins, we do get Callum trying to do the Mage Wings ability, but it doesn't work initially. So he's sort of wondering like, what's going on there? But they do set up that like at least he's drawn the runes on his arm, so if he tries to use it, there's at least the potential for it to work. And then we do get Soren and Callum talking. Soren apologizes to Callum for like teasing him from before, and he basically admits that like the reason he did it is because he was basically jealous of the fact that Callum, despite being not fully related to like the kind of royal line, was still utterly loved by Harrow, and that's something that he didn't really have with his father. He basically admits here that there's kind of always been a disconnect between Soren and his father, and that he was always jealous of Callum for having that relationship that he kind of wishes he could have had. And it's just a nice little moment here. He hugs Callum, and it's a bit awkward. You see Rayla kind of look back at them and kind of go like, oh, humans doing their human things, and the battle basically just starts after this. But do you have any thoughts on those kind of opening scenes before the action?
Yeah, no, really good setup with the ruins. I think that was definitely well played, and I don't know. I think it's always interesting how Callum just has like, he has this ability to just sort of, memorize anything or interpret anything. So, I guess which really just goes in hand with just him and his sort of like normal sort of character traits that he's able to do all this because, it doesn't, I mean, he does mention that, he will be sort of taught it a little bit, but, I don't know, I think it's just interesting to see that ability that he has. But yeah, it's a nice sort of makeup between Soren and Callum and just sort of, how we see that sort of like initial sort of like, sort of like almost like bully sort of moment in sort of like the beginning parts of the show and the seasons, and versus where it is now, and them sort of being, on better terms, if not still a bit sort of awkward just because of how Soren is as a character in general.
Okay, after this, the battle begins, and I'm going to do my best to recap most of this. Basically, the battle starts off, and it's relatively even on both sides. We have like the Sun Elves putting up like a shield wall, and it seems like okay, they're holding most of the enemy off. This is when sort of Kasif ends up like bursting through. He's like the kind of turning point of the start of the battle. And we get like Kasef versus Janai. We see the shield wall gets broken open. Amaya kind of takes her place in the wall. And a lot of the early section is sort of Janai and Amaya sort of like bonding on the battlefield type thing. Ezran arrives with more dragons and sort of swings the battle the other way. But this is when they reveal that the fire from the dragons just empowers the soldiers of Katalis, because of course the sun magic just it increases the kind of heat, so it increases their power. This is when the dragons begin to get sort of pulled down by like the catapults. And we do have a brief cutaway to Zim going to visit his mother and trying to use his lightning to wake her up, but it doesn't seem to work. Callum is of course defending the cliff, so the people who break through, he just uses Aspero and he ends up forcing them all down. Kasif comes up and attacks Callum, and it seems like Callum's about to be killed when we have, of course, the last-ditch reinforcements arriving here. It's very Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, Gandalf arriving here with the Riders of Rohan basically arrive. But it's the Queen of Doran and of course our quote-unquote deserters here, actually using the symbol that Viren gave to them as their sort of flag here. So very cool thing. They completely turn the tide of battle. The archers especially just like completely turn the tide because they're immune to fire, but they can still be killed. So they basically all go down to arrows, and it seems like they've just completely won in this moment. The Queen of Doran kills Kasif at this point as well. But before we get into some of the more plot-focused stuff, just what were your thoughts on most of like the body of the battle that happened?
Yeah, I think it was interesting how they chose to do it and go sort of back and forth, and how they chose, I guess, to sort of show the battle, because you always wonder how, they're going to show sort of like this battle between, two opposing forces that are pretty sort of, I guess, to make the humans to be sort of more monstrous, so that sort of, I guess, lessens the idea that you're sort of destroying humans in this sort of war, this skirmish that you're having here. So I think that was interesting how they chose to show that you don't really sort of get, too many close-up of characters individually sort of being, sort of defeated, but you do see, pretty sort of large-scale sort of attacks from both sides that are taking down characters. So it's definitely, I think you get across, how sort of like, devastating this sort of battle is, and how certain characters have to sort of pull back at a certain time, and sort of the tide of battle sort of goes back and forth, as you mentioned, with sort of like the dragons coming down, but that actually sort of empowering the sort of other side. So no, it's definitely interesting to see how, they chose to show this, this whole overall sort of pretty large scale sort of battle, which I think is definitely sort of like one of the things that's sort of probably like more manageable to do because of the style that they chose to do for the animation in general. So it's cool to see that and sort of how they chose to do this. I think I saw like someone comparing this to like some other shows and wanted to see sort of like battles on this sort of size of scale. So they definitely did a good job for what they could do with showing this whole sort of battle.
Yeah, I forgot to mention it as well, but we do have a big moment towards the start of the battle where Claudia uses a huge magic attack, and this is sort of what basically bursts through the shield lines initially, and she's actually using the sort of sun staff throughout the battle, and you get a big reaction shot of Callum having seen Claudia do this because she clearly kills a bunch of people with this attack, and it's kind of I think meant to be like how close is she to being kind of just Viren sort of 2.0 type thing. So that was a kind of big moment, even though it was just at the very start of the battle. But yeah, it seems like the battle is over. Everyone's kind of looking around. Ezran spots Claudia just walking away from the battlefield, goes over to her. It seems like he comes across a dead body, but it actually is just Viren who surprises everyone by being there. And Soren steps up to protect Ezran, so that involves having to confront his father. Claudia is right there, and Soren stands his ground and stabs his father. Really, really shocking moment. They really get the emotion of this across, of Claudia's reaction to Soren doing this, Soren's own reaction to it, Viren's shock that like Soren would do this. It's a big moment, but it turns out that it was just a distraction. This was just an illusion of Viren, and Viren is actually all the way up at the top of the storm spire. And it turns out Soren didn't actually kill Viren, but it's still a strong character moment in that like he was willing to do it if it was real. So that was a really really big moment. But what were your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, it was a pretty big moment just sort of seeing, what he would do and, how, he said that he would protect, the king or the rightful king, which is Ezran here. And even though it was sort of a misdirection, it's still, you can see how it affects, pretty much everyone there, even though Soren's like, what's, going on with this real sort of situation here. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting to see, Claudia, just sort of her involvement in this sort of situation as well as like the larger scale attack that you mentioned early on here. And I don't know, it definitely does seem like we're sort of leading her towards this sort of idea of being, Viren 2.0, like you mentioned here, just because of how, involved she is in the various plots, even if she's not at sort of like the final battle of things, but she's a willing accomplice as far as we know of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because like it's very very different, but there's definitely some elements of it. Like this is kind of like Azula, Zuko, Ozai type situation of like, you know, it's obviously different because like Soren hasn't been banished, but it's Soren going against his father, and then Azula being the favorite of Ozai, and we're waiting to see some sort of a like change for Azula as a character. It's interesting that we might see something like that. Like whatever way they go with Claudia might give us maybe a potential idea for a direction they could go with like Azula. But it's definitely one of the better parts of the Dragon Prince overall is just this family dynamic overall. And again, like there's still the tease of like the mother is still alive. She's just moved away, I believe, is the situation with them that they explained last season. I don't know. Do you remember what they said about that?
Yeah, that's what they said when they had to sort of split up, when she had to sort of make the choice of who to actually sort of go with. So I don't know. I mean, I think, like we've seen in Avatar, if that does sort of come back into play of things, I think that would be sort of interesting to see how that works out. I mean, I guess, just because of, who are the creators behind this one, and just sort of, with the similarities to Avatar, we're always sort of like comparing those sort of similarities here. So I don't know, I think it would be interesting. I mean, they definitely have, more than enough, at least as far as we know of seasons to sort of like push that sort of idea forward. But I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting because the characters are different. Like Claudia has a whole different sort of personality to her than sort of Azula. Like I think for Claudia, up until maybe this point, it definitely seems like she has a better chance of going to sort of like the writer side of thing, maybe just because of her sort of like quirky sort of personality versus Azula being sort of more sort of serious. So I don't know, I think that's definitely an interesting point to make in the scene where this sort of family dynamic sort of ends up at the end of things, since everyone's still around.
But yeah, as I said, Viren is on top of the spire. We basically cut straight away to like the fight in progress already, which I thought was kind of well done, showing that stuff is happening while other stuff is happening. Rayla gets like immediately overwhelmed by Viren. She's trapped in ice as well, so exactly like her parents. And Viren is left to confront Zim. He does bring up the coins here, kind of basically revealing that like, oh, this is where like another Moon Shadow elf to add to his collection. Now with these, I don't really remember like have these been brought up before. I completely forget the season 1 stuff with Runan, but like did they make this clear that this is he turns them into coins or something like that? Do you?
Yeah, that was sort of the idea that they're sort of in the coins, and at least the ones that are more recently in them, it seems like they're still, they still have some ability to sort of, I guess, sort of have sort of consciousness in that sort of, I don't know, almost seem like you put them in like sort of like a pseudo sort of like dimension, sort of like what they have with Alvaros is sort of being in that other sort of place here. So I don't know. I mean, it makes me lead to believe that if they were able to sort of get hold of those and they actually knew enough about the magic that him, at least the most recent one, would be able to actually sort of come out. So I don't know, I think it's interesting that they sort of bring that up, just sort of that, and with the relation with Rayla, I think it definitely could lead to something if they ever get to that point. But I don't know, with everything that seems to be happening, especially by the end of this episode, it doesn't seem like that's something that's gonna come up soon, or that that information will be sort of like divulged yet, unless it's to sort of like taunt the characters or something like
Mm.
that.
Yeah, because like back in season 1, like Rayla did note when she told the story of her parents that like she knows they're still alive, which I guess is something to do with maybe the flower things as well, that they just like they didn't sense that the two of them had been killed in any way. But it'll be interesting because like with where Viren kind of ends up the season, like where did that bag of coins go? Like I don't remember them focusing on it like dropping anywhere. So is it still with him or what? How do they use them again? But either way, from here we get Zim actually jumps off the top of the spire to get away from Viren, but he uses this tornado of dark magic to sort of draw Zim in and begins to absorb some of Zim's power. This is when Rayla attacks Viren, and she tackles Viren off the top of the spire as Callum is walking up the stairs. So it's this really dramatic moment of like Rayla sacrificing herself to save Zim, Callum seeing her do this, and he jumps off too after her. And it's I suppose this realization as he's falling of like he basically says out loud to himself, "I love you, Rayla," and this is kind of what unlocks the ability to use the Mage Wings ability. So he does it. He gets the wings. He quickly grabs Rayla, and they just I think they show it actually really well of him grabbing Rayla, and then them immediately cutting to Viren just continuing to fall. That like this is gonna be some impact when he hits, and it's obviously meant to highlight like what did Claudia find when she went down there to find him. But nice romantic moment here as Caleb admits to her that he loves her. She says she loves him too. We get a kind of kiss while the two of them are flying. And yeah, after this, it's pretty much victory. Everyone's happy. The queen wakes up. She sees her son. She also sees humans and elves working together, in relationships. And she just notes that she's happy to have her son back. She has hope again for the future, and it's just a very nice moment to end on. There's a couple of interesting things to talk about here, of course. Like the main thing is like she sees Callum and Rayla holding hands, and then Amaya and Janai kind of hold hands, which obviously a lot of people are thinking like, are they trying to suggest that they're going to be a couple, or is it meant to just demonstrate the friendship between the species? It was a bit unclear. I don't think they quite did enough to quite get to romance between those two, but it didn't exactly seem like they weren't obviously going in that direction. So it's it's something they can do if they want to, I suppose. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the kind of final kind of action sequences here, and then our big victory moment?
Yeah, no, I think they definitely had a lot going on to sort of end this sort of battle here, because you think sort of the initial things are sort of finished and completed, but there's this whole other side that was sort of hidden that you see with just sort of Viren trying to draw out the power from Zim, and it's nice to see Zim, try to use his sort of like abilities to sort of protect himself, and even try to like, he gets over his fear of like sort of jumping and sort of really flying, which from previous seasons was like sort of his like sort of like hurdle as a young draddle or young dragon to sort of get over. So it's nice to see that, and to see sort of Rayla sort of finally just try to sort of like do all that she can to sort of to protect the dragon, sort of as her parents did before. And they do a nice job of sort of bringing everything together, and seeing the couple and Callum is sort of getting his sort of ability here. So I don't know, I think it's cool how they sort of push that whole the whole sort of dynamic together, and to see the end resolution of things, of having sort of everyone sort of together at the end, and sort of basically just showing sort of hope for things to come. I think it's a nice way to end. I think it does a really good job of sort of making things seem like it's almost going to sort of come to a close at this sort of point here, without there's still being obviously a couple sort of like loose ends before sort of the final scene here. But even up until that point, I think it does a good job of sort of putting things in a nice
Yeah,
place.
because like, they even cut back to like the battlefield, and we see Marcos is kind of like slightly injured on the side, and one of the kind of female
Hmm.
sun elves comes over and like offers her hand, and he kind of introduces himself, and it is very like positive with regards to like, okay, humans and at least the Sunfire elves is going to be probably an alliance kind of going forward because of this. Obviously there's still lots that we haven't seen, like with Callum did like the impression of the Earthblood elves this season, but we haven't actually seen one of them yet. We haven't seen the Water
Hmm.
elves at all. I don't think they've even been like named or anything like that. And then like obviously Aravos is the only star. I can't remember the exact name. Star elf that we've seen. So like there's still lots of other stuff that we haven't gone into yet. And then like we're still gonna have to go back to the Moon Shadow elves to catch up with them. So it's not over, but it definitely seems like if this was the end of the show, you'd kind of be relatively happy with this in terms of like if this was just a smaller series, like just a kind of one season series, because it's like what 27 episodes over the three seasons so far. Uh, this is it's all been kind of wrapped up relatively well. Like if not for like teases of stuff like Harrow is still alive, Runan is still alive, and then the last scene as we'll get to it. This basically is a resolution kind of type thing, because in so many ways, like the show being called the Dragon Prince, that's kind of over at this point, kind of. Um, the focus, because they've accomplished that goal now. So yeah, I suppose we'll just cover this final scene here. So we cut to Viren. He wakes up. He's like shocked. He has no idea what's just happened. It's revealed that Claudia is beside him, and she reveals that yeah, you did die, but I brought you back. She doesn't say exactly how she did it, but the fact that her hair has gone like half white at this point kind of shows she used dark magic in some way. And then she points out that Aravos is now in a cocoon, and he's been like that for a while now. It's also like a pretty big cocoon, so we've seen him grow from the kind of caterpillar like thing, and now it's giant kind of growing monster apparently. So um, I think the idea they're getting across here is that like they did absorb some of Zim's power in that. Like it's not just that the connection was cut and it all went back to Zim. I think they're getting across the idea that like Arvos for the most part got what he wanted out of this. some of the power of a dragon, and he's now changing into something else. And the question is really like, is he done with Viren now, and so on. That's probably going to be what happens from here on out. I think is that Aravos will probably step up to be our true main villain. He might use Viren for a little bit, but then we'll see him kind of throw Viren to the side, and we'll see what decisions Claudia makes, and that I could maybe see Aravos wanting to get Claudia on his side and just abandon Viren, and that might cause some issues. But what was your thoughts on this as the final scene?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely. I mean, you see the sort of bug thing sort of like grow over the course of the episodes that is sort of in. So to see that is finally sort of like in the cocoon stage, you can sort of see what looks like outline of like sort of like a person with sort of like horns, which is obviously reminiscent of Erebos, sort of like true form as we know it through the mirror. Definitely seems like he took enough power to sort of fuel whatever it is that he sort of really wanted to do. And clearly Claudia had to use sort of like, all of her sort of like dark magic or whatever to sort of bring her father back, since, it's pretty clear that he was dead after falling off of the cliff here. But, she was, so committed to bring him back, just like she did with sort of Soren, before that, he's able to still be here, although he still looks, pretty sort of beat up. It's not like he's sort of like fully in a better place here. So, but no, I think it's the seeing who the villain of the next season is going to be and how that whole sort of, I guess, dynamic sort of plays out is going to be one of the key things to see how, sort of the continuing on of the series is actually going to be, since it does feel like this could be sort of like the conclusion of things without, a couple sort of like side bits that seem like they still need to be sort of answered. I think it did a pretty well of wrapping it up in case, like it wasn't able to sort of be continued.
Yeah, because that probably is the big talking point coming out of the season, is that like there's been some like rumors and discussion about like is there problems with like the production maybe going into season 4, and that like the interviews I've seen in the aftermath have been like they're writing book 4, but they don't have the go ahead right just yet from Netflix. They have the plan in place for like they want to do like I think it's 5 more seasons, and like they showed the roadmap I think at San Diego Comic-Con that the show in season 4 and 5 would be under a slightly different title. It'd be the Dragon Prince subtitle book 4 Earth, and then it would be Dragon Prince subtitle book 5 whatever I can't remember what the exact other one is. And then they're saying that I think season 6, 7, and 8 would be under a completely different title. Like they'd be dropping the Dragon Prince title and going for something completely different after that point. That seems very, very interesting to me. That I think the idea would be that probably the next 2 seasons would be just time skip, dealing with whatever happens comes from Arvos. That would probably be the best way to do it, because I think a time skip would be worthwhile at this point. You move things along and allow you to do something even more. And then, as for the other seasons, like I don't know, like maybe it is a separate story that relates to it, or what. But it seems like they have a plan. They just don't have confirmation yet about if they're 100% going to do it. I've seen mainly positive reaction to this season. I've seen a few people be a little critical that like this season definitely really accelerated through a lot of its plot points, and like they were pretty quick to just boom 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 do everything, and it was a very sudden kind of shift from the slower first 2 seasons. I I think that's kind of a positive. I think they needed to do some big stuff, and I'm glad that they got through some stuff quite quickly. But in general, I have seen a lot of positivity of definitely people wanting to see the show continue. It's just it hasn't been confirmed just yet, and you'd think 3 seasons in, this should be when they fully know what they want to do with the show, like Netflix, that they want to go ahead with this, and it just brings up all the other points of like this was initially talked about as like a big multimedia thing, but We're not hearing much about the games. There's been a couple of books announced, but only like a novelization of book one, Moon, and then a kind of Callum spellbook type thing and an art book. That's the merchandise sort of so far. They did get Funko Pops, I think, announced about a month ago, so there is merchandise starting to come out, but it is weird that the sort of future of the show is a little bit in doubt. But what have you heard, I suppose, about like the future of the show, and where do you stand on the bits of the direction that we've heard about so far?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I know they have the whole sort of like outline for the Dragon Prince, like the just sort of the other Earth book, and just sort of Moon, Sky, Sun, and sort of that whole sort of idea that we have now. So I don't know. It's interesting to see how they're choosing to sort of break it up. It almost seems like it could be sort of like a separate story, which in that case would kind of make sense, sort of how they sort of ended this one, if it were to be sort of like a different sort of direction that wasn't necessarily all about sort of the Dragon Prince. I think there's still a lot that they can do with him, especially the way they ended it up with Varen still being around and Evros and sort of that sort of plot. So for the next two books to sort of cover that and then maybe go in some other direction in the world might make sense to me. I mean, I think the way that they did this season, I guess maybe it was a bit sort of like accelerated from before, but I think it definitely, I don't know, for me, I think it definitely worked towards the better. As far as the place that they're at with all the sort of like building up of the history and stuff, like, I mean, if this were to only get sort of like halfway through and they didn't get to the Dragon Prince, I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know if there would have been enough of a payoff for people to still be sort of like as invested in as it is. I don't know. It's a hard thing to gauge. I mean, I have seen more positive things about it than negative, and it definitely seems like they definitely have strong enough sort of fandom around it that it doesn't seem like it's not completely sort of unnoticeable. But I guess I don't know. Maybe with it just sort of being, I don't know, maybe it's just not sort of as sort of like out there as they would have sort of hoped to sort of, automatically get, like all the books sort of like ahead of time confirmed like we've seen for other Netflix animated series.
Yeah, because like I'm looking at the picture here, and like this was what they posted at San Diego Comic-Con. It's like this slide. It just says the saga, and they have like listed under just the title, The Dragon Prince, is the first three books. Moon, Sky, Sun, which is what we've seen. Then the next two books are The Dragon Prince, and then underneath that is Name Withheld. Earth would be book 4, and then they're not saying what the name of the fifth book is. And then I said 3 books earlier on, but it is just 2 for another thing after that, which is no Dragon Prince, just Name Withheld as the overall title, 2 unnamed books. That seems like a good plan to me. Like 7 seasons, each with like 9 episodes. That's a solid amount. That's, I think, just over the amount of episodes that Avatar: The Last Airbender would have. That would tell a pretty nice story. Especially if like the next 2 books are going to be sort of like part of the same story that we had here to start us off, the Dragon Prince, but like maybe somewhere else in the world at this point in time, or just a direct continuation, a time skip or something, and then you tell what happens afterwards, like many years later or something like that. My guess would probably be that book 5 would probably be Star, because like Arvos is a star elf, and that'll be a overall good finale thing to do. And then that leaves like Water as like something we haven't focused on all that much, and I don't know if they'd call a book Dark, but that's something if they need to. And then I did look up some extra stuff about what they said at San Diego Comic-Con, and they did talk a lot about lore, that like they seem like they really do have this stuff planned out.
Yeah.
Like there was talk about, I only really skimmed over it, but like that if they got like committed to for more stuff, they do have these plans in place for like whole other stories about like different characters set at different time periods, different parts of the world. And that's like the idea of like the video game, is that it's not just adaptations of the books that we've had so far. That all seems great. They just need to get confirmed on a lot of it. And in that like the novelization that I talked about. If you actually look up information on it, it's going to be like a 256-page novel of book one that is apparently from the description going to expand on the story of the first book. So I think that's the impression that like it's I think it's being directly written by Aaron Has as well, so it's going to have probably new information in it. So I think there's definitely some positives. They just need to, I think, get that stuff confirmed. I think that's probably one of the only things that kind of, for me, has me holding back in terms of like not covering it as much in terms of like us doing other podcasts on it that aren't just the reviews, or me doing other videos on my YouTube channel for it. It's just that like I don't really want to commit to something unless I know that they're going to do the full thing. But yeah, like this season was really good, and I think because it was so good, that's why I'm kind of like, can you please confirm the rest so I can like maintain this excitement level? But I suppose, what are your kind of final thoughts on book three, kind of where the series is basically at this point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I definitely understand your sort of like trepidation there as far as, fully committing to sort of being invested in the series because, it definitely is interesting. It definitely has a lot of history to it, as far as, what they have sort of in place and what they have sort of, said that's how, I mean, they have like the whole like deep lore sort of like timeline of Zadia that they've sort of discussed at conventions before. So, for all sort of like intents and purposes, it seems like this is a pretty sort of like well thought out thing. Like, when they were at the sort of convention, they definitely, there's a lot of things that they couldn't say, mainly just because, they're things that they have planned for actually sort of doing in the future. So, they clearly have thought about a lot of different things, but I think, I guess with the show being sort of like the basis of sort of like everything, as well as like the company that they created to sort of promote and support this sort of media, it's all sort of like hinging on that sort of, idea of the show's sort of going to drive the books and drive sort of the other media and the other platforms, which, at this time just seems sort of like a nice thing to sort of like consider and that you should have in plan and at this point. But, is there enough, backing from, investors or funding or Netflix or whoever to sort of, promote this sort of idea sort of going forward, which I guess is just, I don't know, it's odd. I guess this is just sort of the normal idea of media and sort of business in general. But, I guess when it's sort of like hinging out there in the open and, with this being, a new IP, is a harder thing to sort of bank on versus sort of like, Core or Avatar or sort of like Voltron or anything sort of like that we've been covering before, which have, in place sort of fan bases that are already pretty big there. So, you can sort of see, the projection, the trajectory of where to sort of go versus the Dragon Princess. As cool as it is, what is the real sort of reach of it? I mean, we don't know, like that's always the thing people are always asking about for like Netflix in general, like what are the stats on their shows, is that something that you can be used to sort of gauge sort of how well a show is doing, or if it gets like, like a DVD, a real physical sort of like media set. So, I mean, there's so many sort of factors involved with it, and just us sort of just trying to sort of enjoy the show and seeing where it's going is sort of, it's just sort of one of those sort of things that you're always just sort of wondering about. So I do hope that they continue it. I think it definitely has, potential to do a lot more for it, the way that they sort of have things going out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, yeah, I just found the slide where they talk about the deep lore kind of timeline of Zadia. Just like to read it out, like 5,000 years ago, era of the first elves. 2,000 years ago, rise of Ilarion. 1,200 years ago, era of Sol Regum. 1,000 years ago, division of Zadia, era of Luna, Tenebris, and the Mage Wars. 300 years ago, era of Avazandum, the Fallen Star, the Orphan Queen, and then modern era, the return of Erebos. And then I believe if you look into the SDCC stuff, they do talk about the Fallen Queen as if it's this like second series, like movie type thing almost that they're planning. I was really kind of unclear about it. Like the information seemed a little kind of vague about like is this a full thing, or are you just kind of saying like theoretically, if we were allowed to do this, this is the plan? It's kind of, it's very kind of unclear. Of like they have a lot planned, but like they don't actually have to go ahead to do most of this stuff. So that's where you really want to see it get confirmed, because like imagine they put out an Avatar timeline like that and just told us about like these timeline of events like that. Like we'd all be freaking out and want to know all of those different things. Because like with Avatar, we never really get lore mentioned in that way. Like I don't really remember like Mike O'Brien ever saying the word lore like in relation to Avatar really. And you kind of wish they do some of this stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much all we want to say on this one on the podcast. At this point, like it's really just waiting to see what the next big announcement is for the Dragon Prince, and that is first to just see it get confirmed for the fourth season, see what the first batch of merchandise that is coming out is like. And see what happens with stuff like the video games and so on, because I think it's popular enough to justify all of this stuff. It just has to, get confirmed. Yeah, that's been the podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.